Purpose or goal of the Mushroom and Fungi badge is to encourage boys to take a closer look at one of the wonders of God's creation, explore and investigate the great outdoors, and finally, pay attention to small details. There are a lot of interesting mushrooms that are sometimes quite small and not always in obvious places, so it takes some exploring and close examination to find and appreciate them. What this badge is not intended to do is to teach or assist boys in finding and or consuming edible wild mushrooms. The reasons will be detailed later. Completion of the badge also does not require the boys to identify the mushrooms they find by species. They are only required to identify them by one of 4 general visual characteristics. The first 3 questions in the learning section of the badge are: Number 1, what is a mushroom? Number 2, what are the 2 major ways that mushrooms and fungi differ from plants? And number 3, list and describe the 2 main functional parts of a mushroom or fungi. All mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi can be called a mushroom. Most fungi produce a fruiting body. That fruiting body is called a mushroom. It produces and disperses the reproductive cells called spores. This is the first thing that makes fungi different from plants. Plants produce seeds. The other main functional part of a fungi is unseen and sometimes may even be larger in mass than its visible parts. It is called the mycelium, which are similar to the roots of plants. This is the second way in which fungi differ from plants. Fungi do not obtain their energy from the sun by means of photosynthesis, as plants do. Fungi get their energy and nutrients by absorbing them through their mycelium. Typical mushrooms have 4 basic parts: a cap, a stipe or stem, a base or bulb, and the mycelium attached to it. The cap's appearance can vary considerably. Its surface can be smooth and all one color, or have warts and scales, and contain many different colors in different patterns, or zonations or striations. It can also vary considerably in size and shape. Its underside will generally have some form of gills or pores, the color of which can either be the same as the top of the cap or a completely different color. The stem or stipe can also vary in texture, size, and color. It may also contain a ring or veil that can sometimes be partially attached to the underside of the cap. The stem may also be non-existent in some species. The base or bulb is not always visible, usually embedded in soil or other attachment point. The mycelium are not visible, and even if a mushroom is pulled from its attachment, only stubs or remnants of them will remain attached to the base. Question 4 of the learning section asks cadets to describe the different types of mushrooms. They can be grouped into 4 different types based on appearance. Those 4 categories are bracket or shelf types, cap and stem, branching and clumping types, mold, fungus, crust fungi, and puffballs, etc. Question 5 asks cadets to describe or define a morel and a truffle. These 2 questions are going to be combined in the following section. Our first example of a bracket or shelf mushroom is called dryad saddle or pheasant's back. This mushroom is quite common. It gets the name from the shape, which is something like a tractor seat, and the coloration on top is similar to that of pheasant feathers. It is not poisonous, but generally not recognized as edible unless the specimens are very young and tender. It can grow on both living and dead trees. Growing on living trees, it can cause a white rot in the heartwood. Our next example is called an artist's conch. They are also fairly common, but not quite as common in the dryad saddle. The unique thing about this mushroom is that the underside will produce a dark stain when it is bruised or scratched. So it will leave a permanent mark of whatever you've scratched or bruised into it. That's where the name comes from. It is inedible, mainly due to the fact that it's so woody and hard. It is mainly found on dead trees, but can also be found on living ones. On living trees it's parasitic, and it produces a white to straw-colored rot of the sap wood and heartwood. Our next example has a common name of chicken of the woods or crab of the woods because of the way some people think it tastes. It can also be called a sulfur shelf because of its color. It is not very common. It can grow on living or dead trees. If it grows on a living tree, it causes a brown rot in the heartwood. Young specimens are edible, but should not be eaten raw, which is true of most wild mushrooms. Some people have reported stomach upsets after eating it. These can be severe in about 10% of the population, but this is mainly thought to be the result of confusion with an identical species, which means this mushroom has a poisonous look-alike. Our next example has the common name of white cheese polypore. That name comes from the appearance of the underside of the mushroom, which is white and resembles cottage cheese or other white cheeses. It is not very common. It is edible. It has a mild or indistinct taste or slightly bitter. Our next example is a turkey tail mushroom. It is the most common bracket or shelf type mushroom that you will find. It lives on dead trees, feeding on the dead wood of hardwoods. There is also a false turkey tail that looks very similar. It is inedible because of its texture. Our final example is called an angel wing mushroom. It causes a white rot and decay on the living trees it grows on. It is quite uncommon to rare. Use caution if you're going to eat it. Up until 2011 it was regarded as edible, but in 2011 there were 2 documented outbreaks involving fatal brain damage. Both of those outbreaks occurred in Japan. Our first cap and stem example is called a shaggy mane mushroom. That's its most common name. It's also sometimes called a shaggy ink cap because of the fact that it turns black when it matures. And it's also sometimes called a lawyer's wig because of its shape. It's quite uncommon to rare. It's a very good example of how mushrooms change their appearance while they mature. The young and mature versions are virtually unrecognizable from each other, as you can see in the photo. It's also unusual because it will turn black and dissolve itself in a matter of hours after being picked or depositing spores. It's an excellent edible when it's young, provided that it's eaten soon after being picked. It's also capable of killing and digesting 2 nematode species. Those are small worm-like animals that are often parasitic. Despite its fragile appearance, emerging shaggy mane cap mushrooms can generate enough power to lift asphalt pavement into the air in segments, fragmenting it in the process. They do this by gradually absorbing water and slowly expanding, exerting upward pressure far out of proportion to their fragile substance. Our next example is called a scarlet cup, or it's also sometimes called a scarlet elf cup. It is fairly common, but can be difficult to spot because small size is much more common than large specimens, and it is easily hidden by leaf litter or decaying wood it grows on or beside. It lives on dead or decaying organic matter in the soil. It is said to be edible, inedible, or not recommended, depending on which expert you find. It is one of several fungi whose fruit bodies have been noted to make a puffing sound of spore discharge. Our next example is called an orange mycena. It is uncommon, but easily spotted because of its bright orange color. The taste has been described as mild or slightly mealy. If you handle this mushroom, the pigment will rub off and stain your skin. This is actually a branched or clumped type of mushroom, wherein the stems branch from a common origin, but it's being included here because of how it appears on the surface. Our next example is called a pinwheel mushroom. It is also sometimes called the little wheel or collared parachute. It is quite uncommon, quite small, has a nice interesting shape, but it can be quite difficult to spot without careful observation because of its size. When it dries up, it blends in with the ground cover and is almost invisible, but it can rehydrate back to its original shape and even continue to release spores for up to 3 weeks. It's generally considered inedible but not poisonous. The mushroom has no distinguishable odor and its taste is mild or bitter. It feeds off dead organic matter in the soil and is not parasitic. Our next example is called honey fungus. It's also sometimes called a stump mushroom or stumpy because of its habit of growing around the base of stumps. It can also be found away from stumps, growing from buried, decaying wood in the soil. It's fairly common and usually easy to spot, especially if it's growing in large clumps. It can be parasitic, causing what's called armillaria root rot in some species of trees. Eat it with caution. Some individuals have reported allergic reactions. Also bear in mind that it does have poisonous lookalikes. Our first example of a branched or clumping type mushroom is called a jack-o'-lantern mushroom. Obviously it gets its name from its color. It's quite uncommon. The gills are said to be bioluminescent. A blue-green color is supposed to be able to be observed in fresh specimens in low light, but this is disputed by some authorities. It contains a toxin and is poisonous to humans. While not lethal, consuming this mushroom leads to very severe cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. Complicating its toxicity is the fact that it smells and looks very appealing and is very similar in appearance to an edible mushroom. It lives on dead and decaying organic matter, growing in large clusters on the stumps or buried roots of hardwoods. Our next example is called hen of the woods, also sometimes called ram's head or sheep's head. It is uncommon and it usually forms fairly large clumps at the base of trees. It is prized in traditional Chinese and Japanese herbology as a medicinal mushroom. It often grows in the same place for a number of years in succession. It is widely eaten in Japan. Popularity in Western cuisine is growing, although the mushroom has been alleged to cause allergic reactions in rare cases. It is inedible when older because it is too tough to eat. Our next examples are called coral mushrooms. The typical coral mushroom lives on dead or decaying organic matter, growing alone or in small or large groups on dead wood. Most species are edible. The taste is said to be mild or peppery. The wrinkled coral mushroom, slightly different in that in this photo it is growing on hidden or buried wood in the soil. That's why it appears to be growing more in smaller individual clumps rather than in larger clumps. Our next example is called the lion's mane. They are uncommon to rare. They feed on the central dead parts of a living tree, often fruiting high on living tree trunks and intermittently fruiting on occupied trees over several decades, even continuing for many years after the branch or trunk falls to the ground. They are considered to have medicinal properties and to be a choice edible when they are young. Puffballs in general are not very common. Many are edible, but use caution. Some people find them indigestible. The size can vary considerably. Spores are produced internally and released when the outer surface dries and ruptures. In November of 2017, I found 20 giant puffball at the Upper Makatawa Natural Area. This is extremely unusual, both because of the numbers and the size. Some were larger than a basketball. The stump ball mushroom, or stump puffball, is also uncommon. Like all puffballs, it has no recognizable stem. It feeds on decaying logs, both deciduous and coniferous wood. It is considered a choice edible when still immature and the inner flesh is white, which is true of all edible puffballs. The stump puffball is one of only a few puffballs that grow on wood, making it fairly easy to identify. It has an amazingly tough skin that can survive for months or even over winter. The false earth star is quite rare. It forms a symbiotic relationship between a fungal symbiont, or intermediary, and the roots of trees. It resembles a puffball when young. When it matures, the outer layer of the fruit body tissue splits open in a star-like manner. It is either regarded as unknown edibility or too tough to be edible. However, they are regularly consumed in Asia. Dead man's fingers are also quite rare. They are related to truffles because of how they produce spores, but they are inedible. The individual sections of the specimen in our photo are fused, so they don't look as much like dead fingers as some of the most gruesome-looking, unfused examples do, which look exactly like the fingers of a corpse sticking from the ground. They feed on rotting or injured tree stumps and decaying wood. Yellow brain fungus is also quite rare. It's frequently found on dead but attached and on recently fallen branches. Within a few days after rain, it dries into a shriveled mass capable of reviving after subsequent rainfall. Although some have claimed the fungus to be inedible or merely non-poisonous, most other sources agree that it is edible but flavorless. Witch's butter and coal fungus are both rare wood-rotting species. They are typically found on dead, attached, or fallen branches, and feed on dead and decaying wood. Both are inedible. Dried and shriveled fruit bodies of witch's butter are revived in wet weather and regain their expanded shape and gelatinous texture. Coal fungus is said to be a useful form of tinder for fire lighting, hence the alternate name, King Alfred's cake. Crust fungus in general have no visible mushroom-like structure. They differ from molds in that they are usually much thicker. The colors vary considerably from all one solid color to a mixture of colors, or with an outline as in these photos. Scrambled egg slime mold is rare. It's technically not a fungus. I included it here because it is easily mistaken for and resembles a fungus. It is actually a slime mold. It's not a plant or animal. In fact, it is a soil-dwelling amoeba, a brainless, single-celled organism. It's a mold that can move, but not something that is observable. It would be something like watching grass grow. It feeds by engulfing bacteria, spores of fungi and plants, protozoa, and particles of non-living organic matter. Morels and truffles are probably the best known, most sought after wild edible mushrooms. Morels cannot be grown commercially or farmed, so unless you are fortunate enough to find your own, they are very expensive to buy, and obviously for that reason, morel hunting grounds are usually closely guarded secrets. They are commonly found in areas that have been recently burned. Morels differ from other cap and stem types in that they do not have a conventional cap. The entire upper part of the mushroom is made up of folds that produce and disperse the spores. In 2015, in the Kalamazoo area, there were at least 10 people poisoned by eating misidentified morels that were actually false morels. Both look very similar and at first may even seem to be tasty and perfectly edible. If you want to pick your own morels, the best advice is do it with an experienced person at first. The second best advice would be to take a hands-on class, maybe from the county, DNR, an extension service from a local school or university, or join a mushroom hunters club. The third best advice would be to do some internet research, check out some books from the library, or buy a good field guide. The following is a short video on the life cycle and growth of morels. It is quite interesting and give you a little idea of what they look like in the various stages of their growth and what they look like in general when they're growing on the forest floor. Truffles are unlike any other typical mushroom. They are considered to be the most expensive food in the world. First of all, they grow completely underground. They are quite rare, either because they are actually so few or because they are hidden so well that no one has found them yet. Finding them is rarely done without the assistance of a trained dog or pig. Pigs have the disadvantage of also loving to eat them. Truffles are found naturally in North America, but none of the most prized varieties. Although there are hundreds of species, most are inedible. The most prized and expensive varieties occur naturally in northern Spain, southern France, and northern Italy. In March of 2017, the Mediterranean black truffle, one of the world's most expensive, was successfully harvested in the UK 9 years after it was first cultivated. Some gourmet varieties are also being cultivated in North America, but production takes years and is very unpredictable. Truffles are one of the only types of fungi that have no known poisonous species. The second thing that makes truffles so unusual is that they can only have their spores dispersed and therefore reproduced by being eaten and then excreted by an animal, and only a very tiny number of wild animals can actually locate them and or recognize them as edible. A logical question to ask is, how could something with such an unusual growth and reproductive cycle have randomly evolved? The answer is obvious to me. It could not. As an introduction to this part of the presentation, let's answer question 6. Most people, especially cadet-age boys, cannot tell which mushrooms are safe to eat, so obviously they should not be eating them. So the best advice to cadets doing this badge is, do not eat the wild mushrooms that you find. Let's expand on that with some additional advice and information here and in the following segments. Mushrooms fall into 4 general categories with regard to edibility. Number 1, edible. The majority of people who eat them experience no undesirable symptoms and enjoy the taste. 2, inedible. They cause no undesirable symptoms, but because of texture or taste, they are not enjoyable to eat. 3, poisonous. The majority of people who consume them experience some level of undesirable symptom or symptoms, but those symptoms are temporarily and usually do not require hospitalization unless a severe allergic reaction occurs. 4, toxic. Causes a severe reaction that requires hospitalization and in some cases permanent organ damage. The death cap mushroom is considered one of the most dangerous in the world. Even very experienced mushroom hunters have been poisoned by it. One of the reasons it is so deadly is because of the way in which symptoms develop. Symptoms are typically delayed anywhere from 6 to 24 hours after the poisonous mushrooms are consumed, which unfortunately gives the body time to completely absorb the toxins and can also make diagnosis more problematic because of a lack of uneaten specimens for proper identification. The initial symptoms mimic those of influenza or stomach virus. These symptoms can be very severe. After a period of apparent improvement that lasts approximately 24 hours, during which time misdiagnosed patients have often been, regrettably, released from medical supervision, the liver and kidneys begin to fail. Coma, permanent debilitating liver, kidney damage, and death are common outcomes. The second reason for caution in eating wild mushrooms is that they can be very difficult to identify. We've already given you some examples, such as the honey fungus, which has a poisonous look-like, the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, which is poisonous but has an edible look-alike, the shaggy mane mushroom, which changes its shape, size, and color dramatically as it matures, and the morels, which have a poisonous look-alike called a false morel. Some poisonous and toxic mushrooms may even smell, or worse yet, taste good at first. Symptoms might be delayed after eating them. Another reason is that even experts have been fooled by some poisonous mushrooms. Our final caution regarding wild mushrooms is this: never eat wild mushrooms raw. Even experts disagree on the edibility of certain mushrooms. The reason for this is because each person will react differently to the various chemicals, enzymes, proteins, etc. that are in all mushrooms. Even morels contain small amounts of hydrazine toxins that are destroyed through cooking. Because of this, morels should never be eaten raw. It has been reported that even cooking morels sometimes can cause symptoms of upset stomach when consumed with alcohol. The best advice for eating wild mushrooms is, first of all, be certain that you have properly identified the species that you have found. Second, do some research to find the recommended cooking method and procedure, because some wild mushrooms need to be boiled and the water changed several times to assure that the toxins have been completely neutralized or removed. One final problem you might run into collecting wild mushrooms: slugs and other wildlife might beat you to it. They seem to enjoy eating them as much as you might.